Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Teens for Business, and I'm your host, Jackie. Thank you guys all so much for joining. And today I'm super excited to have a chat with Jeff Grimes, an entrepreneur and the co-founder of Shades. I actually first met Jeff when I was participating in the University of Pennsylvania's Management and Technology Summer Institute, MNTSI, where Jeff came and talked to all of the students there about all of his experiences. So thank you so much for joining me here today, Jeff. Would you like to give a brief introduction about yourself, experiences?
Yes, thanks for having me. I'm excited have a conversation today, but happy to give a brief introduction of myself. My name is Jeff Grimes, and I'm, as you mentioned, the co-founder and chief product officer of Shades. We are creating what we believe is a new way for people to stay informed and consume online news and information. You see quick summaries of multiple points of view about everything happening in the world, from politics to sports and music to cultural trends to celebrity gossip, whatever it is. We have a Shades page for it, and that's where you see different perspectives and see the big picture. And I've been working on Shades for about 9 months after I was previously at Google for 7 years as a product manager. So happy to talk about all of those experiences.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And then my second question actually relates to what you talked about Shades. And so you're like the co-founder and also the chief product officer. How did you really get the idea to start Shades? Like, where did that kind of grow from?
I'm working on Shades with two other people. So there's three of us co-founders: Sonali Mitra, Julio Avalos, and me are the three. And we came at this from different angles and got connected about a year ago when we realized we had really similar ideas. So Sonali and Julio had originally had this idea, and they had gotten something off the ground. They had an early app that they were testing, and they were looking for a third co-founder to join them. And so we got connected by someone who's now actually one of our lead investors, who I've known for 7 or 8 years. Sonali and Julio have known for even longer. And he introduced us because he knew I'd been working on news products at Google for basically 6 of my 7 years there. So I worked on the Discover feed, which is Google's flagship news and interest feed product. And in that experience at Google, learned a lot about the news ecosystem. How do people follow the news? How do they keep up with their interests? How are publishers involved? How are advertisers involved? How do you make something engaging for users? So I've been immersed in that world for a while, and it was really clear that there were these generational differences in how people consumed news and what they wanted. And we saw the Discover feed, that essentially older generations like the product, younger generations not so much. And when we would do user research and dig into why that was, young people, and especially, even younger half of Gen Z, like teenagers, would tell us, I don't like reading news articles as much, and I'd rather read summaries, but I really want to see multiple perspectives, right? I don't just want one summary. I want to see the big picture. I'm really curious, and I actually would appreciate seeing things I don't agree with, right? And that's where you see a generational difference, where I think a different generation might just want to see something they agree with, right? But with younger people, there's more curiosity, more desire for multiple perspectives. But newsfeed products, there's a bunch of products in the landscape: Smart News, Newsbreak, Ground News, Flipboard, Apple News, Google News, Discover Feed. Artifact is the latest one in the space. They don't deliver that, right? It's just one little article preview at a time, and the only thing you can do is go read the article if you want to see more. So these products don't show multiple viewpoints. They're also just not designed for modern interaction, right? They don't have full screen gestural navigation. The images are kind of small. They're pretty text heavy. And as I said, if you want to learn more, the only option is to go to the publisher article and read the article, as opposed to, you can't really stay in the app and get more. And they're not a multiplayer experience, right? The most signal you can provide is maybe you can leave a comment or, click a heart button, but it's really just you consuming individually. And we heard from people, especially young people, hey, I want to know, what are other perspectives? What do creators think about this? What do my friends think about this? What is the perspective of an individual person, not just this behemoth publisher? So there were other things that manifested themselves, but there were all these trends that I and other people on the team, while I was at Google, had observed, noting, hey, there are these big generational differences, and there really seemed to be an opportunity to create a product that would better serve the needs of young people, who wanted to keep up with news and information online. So I've been thinking about a lot of these ideas, and that investor I mentioned connected me and said, hey, Sonali and Julio have gotten this thing off the ground. They have a huge vision. They're looking for a third co-founder. I think you guys have really similar ideas. So he connected the three of us. We started working together, and I started to get really excited after 7 years at Google. There are obviously over that time period a good number of opportunities. I could have left and either joined another company or worked on something on my own, but nothing really excited me in the way that this did. So I was excited to make the leap and quit officially in November to join up with what Sonali and Julio were doing and become a third co-founder. So that's really what started me on Shades. So it's been about 9 months since then. But as I mentioned, we came at it from different angles, got connected, and now have this awesome shared vision that we're really excited about.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. And then when you speak about like the shared vision and like how you kind of get that off the ground and make that into an actual product, so would you have any advice for aspiring like teenage entrepreneurs? Like, how do you take an idea or take something super small and actually make it into something people can use, into something that's not just existing in your own head per se?
The biggest advice I can give, and I'll give the caveat that I'm only 9 months in, so I have a couple learnings so far for what that's worth. I do also even before Google, have some previous experiences with making products. I started out in iOS, iPhone and iPad app development. Made an iPhone game with some friends, made a couple other iPhone apps. So I think I've learned a little bit, and my biggest piece of advice, especially if you're building something like what we're building, an app, a product that is in the hands of consumers as opposed to businesses, I think it's really important to be experimental and iterate and get something out quickly. And I think this ties into a more general piece of advice, which is it's very easy to start something. And this could be in the context of, a project, I think is most applicable, any side project or venture that you want to start on the side from school or on the side from class or whatever it is. A lot of people can start these, but I think probably 90+% never actually create a finished product. And I think that is true for a number of reasons, but the largest is probably that people, they let the good be the enemy of the great, and they want to make a really complete, compelling final product, when in reality, I think in most cases it's better just to get something small out, as long as that small thing is actually usable. It doesn't need to be perfect. There's this phrase called an MVP, a minimally viable product, and I think that's a really important piece of advice to keep in mind, which is just put something out there that starts the process going, that gets the ball rolling and lets you get feedback. So if you have an idea that you want to try, think about what's the minimal way that you could test whether this is actually a good idea. Even if it's making a really small set of features, a really minimal, whether it's a website or a physical product or a business idea, find the smallest way to test it, and test it even with a really small group of people. Get it into the hands of 6, 7, 8 people, see what they think, do really in-depth conversations with them, and you'll probably have a good sense of, hey, either I'm onto something, or I didn't really get any interest from any of those people. Not that that's statistically rigorous, but still, if none of 6 or 7, 8 of your close friends are going to say, hey, I use this and I liked it, then you know that's good that you got feedback on that product and you can maybe move on to something else. So we've tried to do that with Shades. We put out what we consider the beta version of our product in February, and it shows the core idea of Shades, which is you get to see quick summaries of multiple points of view, which we think is the best way to stay informed. And we've gotten some really positive reaction and feedback to that beta that we put out there. But at the same time, the product is quite minimal in its features, and it's actually a little rough around the edges. It's not the most responsive app to use. So by no means is it an ideal product, but we do feel that it's allowed us to get off the ground. It's gotten some of our early users excited. And we've been able to start our momentum that way. So that's my biggest piece of advice: is start small, figure out what's the smallest thing that you can actually package into a finished product, and start getting feedback on that. And don't be worried about building something completely perfect.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense because you always want to make sure like what you're building like has all like the things done well. Like if you're going to make the final product, like you just don't jump into it. I talked to one of the previous guest speakers who's also a professor at Penn, and that's something really similar to what he said. He was like, don't try to make like this perfect product all at once, like do it in steps so you're not just like missing something. So that I thought that was very interesting. And then you also said that you were a product manager at Google. So what was that experience like? What does being a product manager really even mean?
I loved it. I had a great time in my 7 years at Google. It was longer than I thought I'd stay, and I think that's a reflection of how much I did enjoy it. So I was lucky enough to be part of the associate product manager program. I did an internship after my junior year at Penn, and loved that experience. I'll talk more about what it means to be a PM and what was my experience, but I loved it. Was excited when they offered me to come back in a full-time capacity. So then after I graduated in 2015, came back out to the Bay Area where I'd grown up and joined Google, where I stayed for 7 years. But that associate product manager role allows you to join right out of college as a PM. And it's a 2-year program, and then you graduate into being a full-fledged product manager. So 2 years as an associate, and then a product manager after that. And to your question on what it means, I mean, it's almost this joke in the industry about there's so many different ways to define what a PM does, but in reality, you're setting the vision for what a product should be. I think that's the simplest way to describe it. And beyond that vision component, you also have to execute, creating those changes to the product, building a product, bringing something to market. It varies a lot based on the team and circumstances and company and everything, but really it's those two components. You have to be strategic, so you have to understand the landscape. What are our competitors doing? What do users want? What's the right way to approach this? What kind of product should we make? Or if we have an existing product, how should we improve it? And then there's a tactical piece of, okay, we've identified what we want to build. How do we actually do it? How do I work with a team of, in my case, I've always been working in software development. So we worked with a team of software engineers, interaction designers, user researchers. You have salespeople, legal, finance, marketing, upper management, the whole constellation of people involved in bringing a product to market. You are acting as the leader of actually getting things done and making progress. So there's really both components, and both of them require you to do pretty different things. So that's why a lot of people will tout the main benefit, or the most interesting and fun thing about being a PM is that there's a huge variety in a given day and a given week. I think much more so than compared to other roles, which tend to be more specialized. You're bouncing around between a dozen different things on a given day, and that can be really compelling. And for me, that was compelling. I think I consider myself a generalist, and most PMs tend to consider themselves generalists. Someone who doesn't necessarily have really deep experience in one area, but someone who has a broader variety of skills, and wants to experience that variety in a day-to-day sense, and not immerse themselves in one thing for weeks at a time. So if that sounds interesting, then that kind of person will probably be attracted to the PM role as well. So happy to talk more about specific things I worked on at Google if that's interesting, but that's essentially an overview of how I see the PM role, and why I enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Would you like happen to have any examples of like a specific project you did or something like that?
Sure. I worked on a couple different projects while I was at Google. As I mentioned, I worked on the Discover feed. I also worked generally within a couple different projects for Google Ads. So while I was working on the Discover feed, I spent most of my time working on how do we bring ads and how do we generate revenue for that product. I'll give an example that I mentioned in the session when we talked at the MNTSI program, but this was an example of something in my first year, when things went a little wrong, but it's also a good illustration of the kind of impact even a young person can have as a product manager, because you get to be a leader. So I know you know this story, but I'll tell it again for everyone listening. So I was working on Google search ads. So when you make a Google search, if you search for something commercial, like if I search for car insurance or flower delivery or something like that, I'll see ads at the top of the page, right? There's the ads at the top, and then there's what we call the organic results below it, which are not sponsored. And the search ads UI team, which UI stands for user interface, that was the team I was on at Google, and that team was responsible for the look and feel of ads. So at Google scale, because it's one of the most widely used products in the world, obviously, you can actually get really meaningful results from very small changes. And so the search ads UI team we would run big tests sometimes, or we would try something really different to ads, but we'd also run a lot of really small, we call them tweaks, because you're just tweaking a really small component of the ads. And Google, at Google, we were all very data driven, and so we call them A/B tests, right? So you have essentially an A treatment and a B treatment, and you're using the scientific process to say, okay, we've made this slight divergence. So for example, maybe there's a dividing line between the ads, and we might change it from 1 pixel tall to 2 pixels tall, something really small like that, an extremely small detail that almost is imperceptible to the naked eye. But at the scale of Google, even such a small change can create really different results. So there's actually a lot of value and opportunity to improve the product in just these small tweaks. So anyway, I was tasked in my first year with running a variety of these experiments. And part of the interesting thing was I got to decide what experiments they would be. It wasn't like I was given a list of experiments to run. So I did a bunch of brainstorming, and we wanted to test a variety of things. And one of the things we tested was the color of the links. So when you see Google results, whether it's an ad or an organic result, it's a hyperlink to that page. And it has the classic blue internet hyperlink. Essentially on every website on the internet, hyperlinks are that same color blue. So I thought, hey, part of my job as a PM is to come up with ideas for what we should do. And I think we'd learn a lot. Even if it's not a successful experiment, you still learn something. So let's try different shades of blue. So we came up with something like 14 different shades of blue. And again, because Google has such large scale, this wasn't just an A/B test. This was an A, B, C, D, E, F, all the way to the 14th letter test, because we had so many different things we were trying. And in color space, you can represent colors as RGB, red, green, blue, or you can represent them as HSB, hue, saturation, brightness. So we had chosen the HSB color space. And so we kept the hue and the saturation constant, and we only modified the brightness. So this essentially is the same hue of blue, but ranging from light blue to dark blue within that hue and saturation. So we had light blue to dark blue, 14 different candidates, put them all into an experiment. And so people around the world started seeing these different shades of blue, and we keep track of all the metrics. And what was really interesting, without going into all the internal details, which I shouldn't fully divulge, but just at a high level, there was a really interesting trend that really well correlated to the brightness level. And so I was thinking, hey, what's the extrapolation of this? The extrapolation of the trend was taking brightness all the way to 0, which is actually the color black. No matter what the hue and saturation are, no matter what color you have, if you take brightness to 0, you get black. If you take brightness to 100, you get white. And so I thought, hey, let's see how far this trend goes. So I asked the engineer who had actually written the code for the experiment to add an experiment arm with fully low brightness, which means black. And so there was a small fraction of people around the world who started seeing all the links on the page as black, which is actually pretty jarring because subconsciously we're so conditioned to, okay, hyperlinks are blue. They're always blue. They're always blue. But now here's even a small percent of people seeing black. And, there are a number of things I should have done differently without going to all the details. But one of them was I asked this guy to do it on a Friday, which, is never a good idea because, people aren't there on the weekend in most cases. And so he put that experiment out on a Friday. And by the time everyone got back on Monday, there was a little bit of uproar online where people were upset. There was some commentary on Twitter, actually a couple of articles written about it. It was on the front page of CNN Money, which is, hey, why is Google turning this page black, right? This is a bad idea. It's too weird. It's hard to parse the page. And so, I just owned up to it. I said, hey, I made a mistake. I should have checked with more people. I think there's benefits of trying to move quickly and do things, but I should have realized, hey, this is actually a pretty sacrosanct thing, the color of hyperlinks being so different. Dark blue is one thing, but black is another thing. And doing this on a Friday was a bad idea. So I learned some lessons there, but I do think it's an interesting way to illustrate, hey, I think I was 22 at the time. So I was just fresh into my career, relatively young, didn't have a lot of experience, but I was still trusted to run these experiments for Google, which were pretty visible and high impact. And I'm very grateful for that. And I think that's kind of speaks to the PM role and the kind of responsibility you can have. So there were some experiments I ran that were more successful, luckily. But that was a good experience and just a learning opportunity where, okay, I was a little too cavalier on that. And, Google, we actually at the time had to issue a press statement to just show people that we knew we had made a mistake, and we took down that black treatment and left the other ones running that were blue. But that's yeah, that's something I actually think back fondly on, even though it was a mistake. It's just a funny thing that happened, and kind of illustrates the role of a PM, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. I always really enjoy hearing that story. I mean, heard it once, not like always, but I think it's really interesting to hear. And I think like the first time I heard it, I thought like it kind of really encompasses like the two parts of being able to like lead your team, but also have like the more tech part and like putting those two together like as a PM. So very interesting tidbit. And then for the next question, as you kind of like gone through your career, so like PM at Google and then now starting your own company, things like that, like what skills specifically do you think are most important for success and finding that route?
Hmm. Yeah, let me think about that. I'm trying to think of commonalities between Google and now in Shades. I mean, I think one of them I've already covered a little bit, which is you have to be experimental, and beyond that, there's actually a framework that Jeff Bezos outlined in one of his shareholder letters. And this is something I found really helpful, which is to be deliberate about how you make decisions. And I say that because as someone who is a product leader, I described the role of a PM a little bit. And it's kind of the same true even at a very small company at Shades, right? It's just a couple of us trying to get this off the ground. But I think the same principle still applies, which is you have to make sure that your team is making decisions in the right way. It's very easy to become inefficient and unnecessarily risk averse. And so what I mean by this is I mentioned this Jeff Bezos framework. He talks about there's two types of decisions. There's type 1 and type 2 decisions. A type 1 decision is called type 1 because it's a one-way door. You go through the door, which represents making the decision. And if you don't like what you find on the other side of the door, you can't really go back because it was a one-way door. The only way to go back would be with relatively disastrous consequences. You'd have to break down the door, to continue the analogy. Versus a type 2 decision is a two-way door. You make the decision, you go through the door. Don't like what you find on the other side, no problem. You can just go back through the door with not much consequence. So I'm just using this as an example of helping the team clearly delineate between these two types of decisions. There are important ramifications of this. With a type 2 decision, because it's easily reversible, you shouldn't, in most cases, spend a huge amount of time belaboring the decision. Because if the consequences aren't that great, you can just undo it, especially in software. As I said, I've spent my whole career in software. It's different than hardware. In software, it's mostly just a feature flag that you can turn off. If you launch a new feature and users hate it, it's okay, just reverse it, right? Go back to the way it was before. And a couple people might still be, traumatized by the bad experience, but that's still pretty unlikely. And they'll say, hey, at least they listened to us, right? This company tried to make a change. There was an uproar. They reversed the decision. And especially for Shades, we're an early company. I would actually love if there were millions of people outraged if we changed something about the product. That'd be a sign that we're succeeding in some way. But right now, we're still obviously small and early. So almost everything is that type 2 decision. And at Google, it was actually largely the same thing. Even that Black Links example I mentioned, the consequences actually weren't that great, right? People's memory tends to be short with this kind of thing. There's so much that's always being talked about on Twitter and online. And so we did the right thing in that case of say we made a mistake, issue a short statement, turn off that experiment, and that's it. A day later, everyone had forgotten about it, right? Now, there are some type 1 decisions in software, but it's especially common in, let's say, hardware, for example, right? If, Samsung is going to ship their next phone and they screw up the fingerprint sensor, that's essentially a type 1 decision because you can't just recall the phones, certainly not without massive consequences, financially, damage to the brand, consumer trust, etc. So you really have to get that right. So you actually should probably belabor that decision. You should do an extremely high amount of testing. You should make sure every single stakeholder is aligned on exactly how the fingerprint sensor is going to work. But with type 2 decisions, which tend to be like 95% of decisions in my case, you should move faster. You should not necessarily need full consensus from everyone. You should allow intuition to be more dominant. You maybe should just choose one person who is the expert on that thing. Ray Dalio calls this believability scores. You should say, hey, who has the most believability on the subject? Let's just let them make the decision and roll with it. Worst case, we undo it when we launch it, right? So anyway, without going into more detail on that, that's just an example of one thing that I think has allowed our teams to be successful is being conscious of how do you make decisions. And the extrapolation of this is just, as a product leader, you are part of shaping culture, and culture has many ways it manifests itself. Team morale and how you spend time together and how you communicate with each other. That's one thing. That's one component of culture. Another component is how you make decisions. So this type 1 versus type 2 dichotomy. So I think that's just one piece of advice, which is be deliberate and excited about shaping culture and realize that there's many different facets to culture. Another thing, I guess really the second thing I'll point out of two is this mentality of do whatever it takes. I think that has allowed, when I think about the most successful people I've worked with, they're people who can operate, there's that analogy of the 30,000 foot view, right? If you get to a huge elevation, you can see the landscape in a way that you can't. But the best people I've worked with can operate at the 30,000 foot view. They can also operate at the 3 millimeter view, where they're extremely focused on one small thing and they're just grinding it out on that one small thing, even if it's not very glamorous. And so that's the other thing that comes to mind is be willing to modulate between both as needed. And sometimes the 3 millimeter view is what's needed, and it may not be the most fun thing, but if it helps the team and helps the product, you just got to grab an oar and start rowing. I think that's the analogy I use sometimes, which is sometimes you don't actually have to worry about which direction the boat is facing. The most important thing is just grab an oar and row as hard as you can. And that might mean doing a bunch of unglamorous work for a while, days, weeks, months, knowing that eventually we'll get back to the more strategic work. But that was something I saw at Google, where you could see a dichotomy between some people felt like they're a little above the work, and that's not unique to Google. It's just, it happens everywhere. Some people sometimes thought they were above that really, manually intensive work, where it's like, maybe you need to open a spreadsheet with 2,500 rows and manually, label a bunch of data. You might be the best person to do that. And if so, you should get to work, and it might take you hours and it might not be fun, but you should focus on it. You should give it your full attention and you should do it. And that will help the team. So that's the other thing that comes to mind is change as needed. Sometimes you get to be in that fun position of strategic thinking, charting the next course, but sometimes you just got to start rowing and don't worry about where you're going, just move the team forward. So you have to know when to switch between those and be good at doing each one.
Yeah, that's some really good advice and a really good motivational piece to leave off on. And just for all the listeners out there, just being able to adjust. I think that's also kind of what you're saying, like adjust to whatever like the situation is, whatever you need to do, knowing that like if it's going to help you in the future, then you should probably just get yourself into that space and just start doing it. And I think that's some really great advice there. But yeah, that's it for today's interview. Thank you so much for tuning in with us at Teens for Business. And I'm your host, Jackie. And to Jeff, thank you so much for chatting with me. I really enjoyed our conversations, and like your presentation at M&T aside, just like this one was amazing. So thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.